Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Chelsea Foxwell, the director of the Center for East Asian Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the final CEAS lecture of the year. So on this occasion, I'd like to thank all of our amazing staff for all they've done all year, including our student support staff and my wonderful colleagues. So the CEAS lecture series is held in partnership with the University of Chicago Library, and it is an initiative that advances the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies mission in fostering dialogue and interdisciplinary collaboration. This annual series presents eminent scholars who concentrate on the study of East Asia in a variety of disciplines. For more information on the series, including past speakers, you can visit the check-in table in the foyer and scan the QR code, which will take you to the series webpage. And you can visit the CEAS YouTube channel, where you can watch a variety of talks and programs that you may have missed from throughout the year or past years that have been sponsored by us. Tonight's talk will also be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel in the near future. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Hoyt Long, who will then introduce Professor Hibi, our speaker. So Hoyt Long is the Andrew W. Mellon Professor in East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the college here at the University of Chicago. And he is a scholar of modern Japanese literature, media, and book history. And he's also worked on platform studies, cultural analytics, and generative AI. His most recent monograph is The Values in Numbers: Reading Japanese Literature in a Global Information Age of 2021. And he's also the author of On Uneven Ground, Miyazawa Kenji, and the Making of Place in Modern Japan from 2011. Please join me in welcoming Professor Long.
All right, thanks very much, Chelsea. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Hibi Yoshitaka here today. I want to thank you for CEAS for supporting the lecture and also his visit. He's been here all week in Chicago. He gave a lecture for the Kim Park Book Program on Monday, and enjoying all that Chicago has to offer, including deep dish pizza. He had the, which you should at least try one time, I suppose, if you're a visitor or a resident of Chicago. I'm really pleased to introduce you to Professor Hibi, who comes from Nagoya University, where he is a professor in literature and has been there since 2009. I think part of the reason why, one of the reasons I invited him to be here is just because of how prolific he's been and how many different topics he's covered in Japanese literature. So he began, his first book was on the rise of the I novel that came out in 2002. The title in English is A Literary History of Self-Representation, where he sort of charts in the Meiji and early Taisho period the rise of novels where the authors chose to focus on their own lives. He then moved from there to write in 2014 to write a book on immigrant literature called Japanese America, tracing kind of the literary exploits of Japanese immigrants in the US, particularly on the West Coast. In 2020, he moved to yet a different topic and had a book called The Birth of Privacy: The Troubled History of Romana Clef in Japan, where he looked at novels that specifically take up real life people, people in the world, and novelize them, and the ways in which those novels have gotten in trouble with the law or been taken up in legal proceedings. To look at that, the way that privacy and ideas of privacy were born. And then most recently was a book called The Empire of Bookstores, where he traces kind of the history of bookstores and book distribution throughout the Japanese empire, to every part of that empire as far as it stretched. And I particularly wanted to bring him here today. Well, as you can see from the kinds of books he's published, he's very versatile and is really open to exploring a range of methods and topics. And he's also been, over the past couple of years, and this is how I got to know him, is through his work on digital humanities. He's one of the sort of the preeminent scholars exploring the use of computational methods and digital databases and digital collections for the study of literature. He inaugurated a kenkyukai, or a research group called Densan Bungaku, or computational literature, which he's run for many years with a collection of scholars, a group of scholars. When the Diet Library came out with its Ngram viewer, because they've been actively digitizing text, he was one of the first to go experiment with it and show other scholars what you could do with this access to large collections of texts. And he's recently started an initiative that explores the use of large language models for literary research, supported by the Kokubungaku Kenkyu Shiryokan, or the Institute for Japanese Literature. So today he'll present some of his recent experiments in bridging distant and close reading, and I'm very excited to welcome him here today to you all, and please join me in welcoming Professor Hibi.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind, generous introduction, Professor Long. I'm Yoshitaka Hibi from Nagoya University. I'm very glad to be here to make this kind of lecture at the Center for East Asian Studies of the University of Chicago. So I'm very grateful for inviting me to the CEAS lecture series. And also, it is a great honor for me to have the opportunity to speak as part of such an outstanding lecture here. The title of my talk today is Bridging Distant and Close Reading in Modern Japanese Literary Studies. First, a brief, very quick introduction, self-introduction. My name is Yoshitaka Hibi, and I teach at Nagoya University. My area of expertise is modern Japanese literature and culture. I have conducted research on the I-novel, immigrant literature, print culture, and more recently, I've been working on the digital humanities approaches to modern Japanese literature, as Roxanne said earlier. So in this lecture, I will introduce two complementary directions. The first is distant reading. Franco Moretti famously analyzed the titles of 18th and 19th century British novels to reveal large-scale patterns to invisible to traditional close reading. Adapting a comparative approach, I examine approximately 6,500 newspaper-serialized novels published in Japan from the 19th to the 20th century, focusing on their titles as a corpus that allows us to trace historical transformation at scale. The second direction is close reading. Computers are said to excel at quantitative analysis, but to struggle with qualitative interpretation. That may be true, but only depending on how we design the task. In the latter half of the lecture, I demonstrate how we can restructure novelistic text into a machine-readable format using the TEI, or the Text Encoding Initiative standard. By encoding textual structure and interpretive categories, we create conditions under which computational analysis can engage more directly with the texture of literary language. I will present both the methodology and concrete example of textual analysis based on TEI encoding works. By moving between distant and close reading, the lecture explores how digital humanities can reshape not only the scale of literary analysis, but also the very practice of reading itself. Okay, distant reading part. Let me begin by explaining the first part of this talk. In this part, I examine Japanese modern newspaper novel from the late 19th century to the mid 20th century by analyzing their titles quantitatively and drawing literary historical insights from the results. This research is directly inspired by the Franco Moretti's essays Style and Sea, a reflection on the 7,000 titled British novel 1740 to 1850, in which he analyzed the titles of 7,000 British novels and explored their rhetorical and historical patterns. I ask, what happened if we apply a similar method to the modern Japanese literature? My dataset consists of works published between 1875 and 1955, based on the comprehensive chronology of newspaper novels compiled by Takeo Takagi. The talk begins with an overview of the dataset. I will then present some basic statistical findings regarding Japanese newspaper novel. Following this, I will highlight three key observations of historically of newspaper novels of modern Japan. One is an increase in vocabulary related to emotion alongside a decline in vocabulary related to the body. The second, a trend toward stabilization in the both authorship and lexical choice in the title during the 1930s and the 1940s. The third, the noticeable rise in diacritic expressions. Basic characteristic of the dataset. Let's begin with the basic. As I mentioned earlier, the dataset was created by the digitizing, refining Takeo Takagi's book, Chronology of Newspaper Novels. The coverage of the data ranges from 1875 to 1955, with a total of 6,495 works. The dataset includes the over 240 newspaper titles published in the various areas from Hokkaido to the Okinawa, and also pre-war Japanese overseas territories like Taiwan, Korea, even in Hawaii. The exact number of authors is still being finalized, but I estimate over 2,000 authors included. Among them are 171 foreign writers. The bar graph shown here on the right plots the number of newspaper novels published in each decade, starting from the 1870s. In the 1880s, here were around 700 works, but this number exceeded 1,300 in the 1890, and the 1910s saw a surge to over 1,400 newspaper novels published. The number then declined from around 1,200 in the 1920s to just over 200 in the 1940s because of the war. In the post-war 1950, the number of works recovered to the over 600. The sharp increase leading into the 1910s is noteworthy, but the rapid decline in the number of working heading into the 1940s is equally striking. I'd like to explore these trends again using another set of data analysis, which I will introduce later in this presentation. Let me spot a bit more some basic statistical facts about this dataset. The graph currently on screen shows the average and the median number of the installments per newspaper novel. The orange line represents the average, and the reddish-orange line represents the median. You can clearly see both lines trend upward over time, indicating that the length of serialization grew longer with each decade. In the 1880s and 1890s, newspaper novel averaged around 30 to 40 installments. By the 1910s, This number had grown to about 100 installments on average, and by the 1930s, it reached 150. Although there was a decline in the 1940s, the average rise again in the post-war 1950s, reaching up approximately 200 installments per work. Now, let me pose a quick quiz. Among Japanese newspaper novels published before the 1955, which work holds the record for the longest serialization, and who wrote it? Which is the longest novel? Okay, Daibo Satsutoge. Yeah, it was the longest one. By the Nakazato Kaizan. This novel was serialized intermittently over a span of 23 years from 1913 to the 1935 across 3 different newspapers. Its total number of the installments reached on the astonishing 2,802. That's great. Okay, go back to my talk. The fact that the number of installments in newspaper serial novel continued to increase through the mid-20th century has rarely been acknowledged in the previous studies in modern Japanese literature. This is likely because no one had attempted to time-consuming task of comprehensively examining newspaper novel to trace changes in their length. Thanks to the availability of digital sources and analytical tools to explore them, such patterns can now be identified with relative ease. Okay, let's go on. I would like to show 3 simple examples of the kind of literary historical patterns that can be identified using a data set. Before that, I would like to briefly explain the pre-processing steps used in this analysis. In the pre-processing stage, I carried out the following procedures. I first performed a morphological analysis of newspaper novel titles using Makehive together with a unique dictionary for modern Japanese literary texts. And the title were segmented into the morphemes, and for each morpheme, information such as its base form, part of speech, conjunction form, and reading was extracted and stored in the structured data set. I then used these morphological annotations to extract specific categories of works. For example, in some analysis, I automatically identify the personal names and place names by selecting morphemes classified as proper noun in the directory. In the dictionary. The first example concerning pattern in parts of speech combinations used in the newspaper novel titles. This graph shows how the structure changed over time from the 1870s to the 1950s. The horizontal axis represents decades, and the vertical axis shows the proportion of titles belonging to each structural patterns. The most noticeable trend is the decline of known construction, that is pink line. This pattern was especially common in the late 19th century, but it steadily decreased after the 900s. At the same time, 2 other patterns become more common. One is a single known title, that is orange, and the other is the known particle known structure, reddish orange line. The increase in known particle known patterns is particularly clear from the 1910s onward. By contrast, verb-based patterns remain relatively limited throughout the entire period. The second example concerns titles containing the character's name. That's, for example, the Sanshiro by Soseki. This graph shows both the number of the percentage of the newspaper novel title that includes personal names. The bars indicate the number of the titles, while the red line shows their percentage among all titles in each decade. Looking at the bar graph, we can see that the number of person name title changes considerably over time. The peak appeared in the 1910s with approximately 175 titles containing person names. The percentage line shows two clear declines in the relative proportion of the pattern name titles. One is 1890s and another in the 1920s. The third example concerns the number of the percentage newspaper novel titles containing the geographic terms. The percentage line shows that the overall proportion of the title containing geographic terms generously decreased from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. There is a temporary rise in the 1930s, but the longer-term trend is downward. So this graph suggests that geographic terms gradually become less prominent in newspaper novel titles over time. In this way, digitizing the chronology of newspaper novel allows us to uncover various interesting patterns. What can quantitative analysis using computers tell us about newspaper novel? What can digital humanities-based approaches contribute to the study of literary history? The first major finding here today is a contrast between the rising emotion-related vocabulary and the decline in the body-related vocabulary. The graph on the left shows the frequency of emotional or psychological terms in titles, while the one on the right shows body-related vocabulary. Here how I prepared these was list. I first manually listed some terms related to emotion and psychology. Then I used LLM. This time it was ChatGPT to expand the list by asking it to generate more similar terms. I used the same approach to create a list of body-related vocabulary. Using this word list, I conducted a computational match against the dataset of morphologically analyze the title. The results are shown in these graphs. As you can see, the use of emotion-related vocabulary steadily increases, while body-related terms decline. The contrast is striking. What this shift signifies remains open to interpretation, but I believe this following can be said. Titles appear at the top of the newspaper column in which the novel is serialized, and they serve to signal the central themes or keywords that guide the reader's interpretation. When a title includes the word related to emotion or psychology, it sends a message that the work should be read with a focus on emotional or psychological aspect. In other words, the increasing use of such vocabulary suggests a growing proportion of the novel centers on the psychological themes. A similar point can be made regarding the decline of body-related vocabulary. It suggests that novels which invite the readers to interpret the story through the lens of the body gradually become less common. This may be a trace of the significant shift in the nature of modern Japanese fiction. The second point concerns the stabilization of authorship and vocabulary in the 1930s and 1940s. Let's look at the graph on the left. This measures the concentration of the authors using 3 indicators. You can see the orange line trends downwards towards the 1940. The bar and line graph also shows a slight increase during the period. This suggests that the fewer authors were writing and the individual authors were producing a higher share of the output. In short, newspaper novels were being written by a more limited, recurring group of writers. Now look at the graph on the right. This one measures how diverse or concentrated the vocabulary in titles was. The metric used is entropy of the title words. The results shown a clear pattern. Lexical diversity increased up to the 1890 and then declined. In other words, from the 1900s onward, novel title began to be generated within an increasingly narrow range of vocabulary. Together, these two graphs suggest that in the 1930s and the 1940s, the community of newspaper novelists became more fixed and language used in the title also became less diverse. This is a very interesting finding. Let us now revisit the two graphs I introduced at the beginning of this presentation. The number of newspaper novels declined towards the 1940s, while the number of the installments per work continues to rise. Taken together, these analyses suggest that from the 1930s to the 1940s, the literary field in which newspaper novels were produced underwent a kind of monopolization. At the same time, the lexical diversity was also diminishing. The third and last point concerns deictic expressions. Deixis refers to the language that anchors meaning to the speaker's perspective in time or space terms, like here, there, this, that, and or now. This graph shows how often such deictic expression appeared in newspaper novel titles. As you can see, their frequency was related low from the 1890s onward, but began to rise noticeably from 1930. What this trend means will need further investigation. However, a deictic expression only functions once the spatial and the temporal position of the central figure established. Words like here, there, now, or tomorrow are always someone's here, there, now, or tomorrow, right? So, in the context of a novel title, who is someone at the center of Deixis? Most likely, it is a protagonist or the narrator. If that is the case, then the consistent increase in deictic expression in title from the 1930s onwards may suggest a rise in narratives that are more focalized through the perspective of the protagonist or narrator. In other words, novelistic narration may have been shifted from an omniscient, detached style toward ones that align more closely with the viewpoint of a specific character or narrator, what Gerard Junet would call internal focalization. And perhaps this trend is also connected to the psychological emphasis in fiction that I discussed earlier. Okay, let me conclude the first part of this talk. Digital humanities analysis on the literary text can detect large-scale textual changes that are difficult for human eyes to notice. Present them with empirical evidence through quantitative analysis. It allows us to visualize patterns through graphs and charts. With large-scale digital archives and advanced computational tools, we may be able to rewrite the history of modern Japanese literature, for example, newspaper novel, in ways that were previously unimaginable. However, digital humanities analysis alone can only provide trends and statistics. Interpreting what these patterns mean requires deep knowledge of the literary and historical context. To build a post-digital humanities literary history, we must combine these new methods with existing rich tradition of the literary scholarship. Okay, let's go to the close reading parts. Okay. So now let me move on the second half. In this part, I will discuss how we can bring quantitative and qualitative analysis together. In other words, how we can combine the distant reading with close reading. The first, let me briefly explain what TEI is. TEI, TEI, or the Text Encoding Initiative, is an international standard for the marking up text in the humanities. In simple terms, it provides a way to add structured tags to a text using XML. With TEI, we can go beyond the basic structure, such as a chapter or paragraph, and add richer layer of information. For example, we can tag characters, place names, annotations, textual variants, and even interpretive keywords. In digital humanities, TEI is not just a way to digitize text. It functions as a research infrastructure. It allows us to analyze texts, annotate them, visualize patterns, and link them to other materials. In other words, TEI turns a text into something we can actively work with. It becomes a data set that we can manipulate, combine with other data, and analyze from multiple perspectives. This opens up a path towards integrating quantitative method with interpretive reading. When we apply TEI to Natsume Soseki's novel, the text becomes embedded with many possible starting points for analysis. Depending on the researcher's approaches, the same dataset can support many different kinds of analysis. In the first half of this talk, I will present a comparative analysis across multiple novels by Soseki. In the second half, I will focus on the single work, Kusamakura, or the Grass Pillow, that explore how TEI can support close reading. Since 1924, I have been working with Yamagishi Ikuko-san and In-Gyeon-san on the project supported by the Japan Past and Present. The project, our goal is created a TEI tagged dataset covering all of Natsume Soseki's long novel and to make it publicly available. At the same time, we are developing analytical methods based on this dataset, including spatial analysis, character network analysis, and the study of how motifs change over time. Although TEI provides a standardized set of tags, it also allows for customization. In our project, we follow TEI guidelines but extend them in several ways. For example, we use a past name tag for personal names, but divide them into two types. One is THR for characters. The other is one non-CHR for other proper names. We also introduced a set of interpretive categories. They are encoded using a ANA attribute within the seg tag. We call these interpretive tags. The categories themselves are based on the structure of the Natsume Soseki Encyclopedia, Natsume Soseki Daijiten in Japanese, edited by the Hiraoka Toshio and others. In other words, we draw on existing scholarship to decide which concepts are important in Soseki's work. Our aim here is to connect traditional literary scholarship with data-driven analysis. To begin, I looked at how often each interpretive tag appears within each text. The frequency is calculated as number of tags occurring per 10,000 characters. The works I focus on here are Kokoro, Botchan, Kofu, and Kusamakura. The resulting graph can be read as a visualization of each work, thematics, and stylistic tendency. Looking at the overall pattern, one feature stands out. Botchan shows consistently higher frequencies across almost all tags than the other three works. In particular, tags related to emotion and body, the personality, class are especially prominent. This suggests, in quantitative terms, that Botchan is strongly oriented toward human behavior, emotional reaction, and social conflict. By contrast, Kokoro, the leftist, shows the longest overall tag frequency. While it still includes more emotion and body-related tags, it has relatively few tags connected to the event, trip, media. In other words, it places less emphasis on the external actions and more on internal states. Next, I expand the scope to all 12 novels and visualize them using a heat map. This figure shows the distribution of interpretive tags across the 12 long novels. If we first look at the overall trend, one point is clear. Across almost all works, the tags for body and emotion are dominant. This confirms that Soseki's novel consistently emphasizes physical expression, perception, and inner life. For example, I'm a cat, 我が輩は猫である, especially high values in these categories. This may be related to the narrative focused on tracking the cat's physical behavior. Other works such as Kofu, 彼岸過ぎまで, Michikusa, and Meian also show relatively high frequency of body-related tags. Now, if we look at the vertical axis, where the works are arranged in the chronological order, there appears to be a shift between Kofu and Sanshiro. On the horizontal axis, the tags are grouped into three broad domains. The left third tag related to the individual. The middle third, more abstract or intellectual domains. The right third, social domains. So from this perspective, a pattern emerges. In Soseki middle and later works, from Sanshiro onward, both the middle and the right section of the heat map become more densely filled. This suggests a broader engagement with abstract and social themes. By contrast, in the earlier works up to Kofu, the distribution is more uneven and sparse. In general terms, we might say this like this. In the early period, each work tends to concentrate on the narrator set of themes. Narrower set of themes. In the middle of the later period, the differences between works become smaller and a wider range of thematic categories appear more evenly. In this way, the heat map based on interpretive tags provides a clear visual overview of the distinctive feature of each work and the historical development of source fiction as a whole. Okay, next I turn to dialogue. In TI, there's a tag called SAID, S-A-I-D, SAID, which marks spoken language, that is dialogue or utterances. Importantly, this tag can also record who speak and to whom. This allows us to structure the text in a way that clearly identifies both the speaker and the listener. In the digital sourcex dataset we made, we have applied the SAID tag to all instances of dialogue across sourcex's long novel. This gives us a strong basis for analyzing how dialogue functions in each work. This figure shows a comparison of dialogue frequency across the 12 novels, measured as a proportion of the total text length. In other words, we count the number of utterances and divide it by the total number of characters. This gives us a sense of how much weight dialogue carries in each work. If we look at the overall pattern, we see something similar to the heat map result. In the early works, the proportion of dialogue varies widely from one novel to another. This variation continues up to Sanshiro. After Mon, however, the proportion drops and then begin a gradual and steady increase. This suggests that the first half of his career, Soseki experimented with different ways of using dialogue. In the later works, by contrast, the use of dialogue becomes more stable. We might also note that as we approached his final novel, Mei-an, amount of dialogue continues to increase. This raises the possibility that Soseki's later fiction takes on a more dialogue-driven, almost dramatic quality. The position of Sanshiro is particularly interesting. Although it is often grouped with Sorekara and Mon as a trilogy, the quantitative data suggests something different. Both the heat map and the dialogue analysis show that Sanshiro is closer to the earlier works. It seems to stand at the transitional point between Soseki's early and later phases. So far, we will look only at the number of utterances, not their length. However, since all utterances are marked with a SAID tag, we can also measure their character length here. This figure shows the average and the median length of each utterance across the 12 novels. The median varies for mostly between 12 and 24 characters. This suggests that the typical utterance in Soseki's novel is relatively short. In particular, from Mon to Kojin, the median is very stable, around 18 and 19 characters. As we saw earlier, the number of utterances increases in the later works. At the same time, the length of utterance also trends to increase. In Mei-an, for example, the Mei-an reaches 24 characters, similar to I'm a Cat and Nowaki. The average is also relatively high. This suggests that characters in the later works tend to speak more at the greater length. Finally, let me combine these two perspectives. This figure is a scatter plot that maps the frequency of utterance on the horizontal axis and the length of each utterance on the vertical axis. From this plot, 3 works stand apart: Noaki, Kofu, and Sanshiro. Okay. And again, Sanshiro is the most intriguing. It was relatively frequent dialogue, but each utterance is short. This creates a pattern that differs from the other novels, placing it below the main cluster in the graph. In other words, Sanshiro shows a distinctive balance between how often characters speak and how much they say each time. Okay, from here I focus on the single work by Soseki and try to connect quantitative analysis to close reading. The text I examine is Kusamakura. Okay, let me briefly explain the novel Kusamakura. That was published in September 1906, and the story is like this. 30-year-old painter Ai visits the mountain village of Naoi, guided by the idea of a detached journey. There he meets Nami, a woman whose behavior seems strange, and finds himself drawn to her, though he tries to keep his distance. Gradually, her past and her relationship with her former husband come to light. In the final scene, as they see Kyuichi, who is living for the war, he's a nephew of Nami-san. The narrator witnessed a fleeting expression of aware in Nami and realized that his ideal vision of painting has been fulfilled. Right? The question here is simple. Can TI-based analysis reveal perspective that are not easily visible through traditional reading alone? In this section, I analyze distribution of the interpretive tag across the novel. For example, the figure you see here is a stacked chart showing how often these tags appear in each chapter of Kusamakura. The tags are color coded, so this visualization allows us to see which tags are more prominent in which chapters. This figure shows a line graph of the number of interpretive tags in each chapter. Looking at the overall trend, one figure stands out clearly. Chapter 12 shows a sharp peak. Okay, this chapter 12 is here. Chapter 12. This chapter comes near the end of the novel. In it, a narrator observes Nami through the window of the inn or while walking along the hibiscus that reflects on her behavior. There's also a brief exchange between Nami and her husband. Because this scene brings together many earlier observations of Nami and represents them in a dense first-person narrative, a wide range of interpretive tags accumulated here. In this scene, chapter 12 can be seen as a key interpretive node in the novel, a place where multiple perspectives converge. Finally, I want to highlight one particular category, the travel tag, green one. Across most chapters, this tag, travel tag, appears only a few times, typically between 0 and 8 occurrences. However, in chapter 13, it suddenly rises to 34 occurrences, which is an exceptional value. In proportional terms, 34 out of 142 total tags, about 24%, are related to travel. This is not only a sharp increase, but also the pattern that differs from all other tags. While many major tags decrease after peaking in chapter 12, the travel tag alone shown in a dramatic rise. As readers of Kusamakura will already know, this is a novel about travel. The Kusamakura is about travel. The narrator leaves the everyday world and visits a remote hot spring village. Even the title, Kusamakura, refers to travel, initially a grass pillow, meaning a traveler's lodging or a journey itself. So the question becomes, what does it mean that the travel tag suddenly dominated in the final chapter? This is where quantitative analysis reaches its limit and where the human interpretation must take over. Kusamakura is a novel that begins with a journey and ends with a journey. In terms of its basic narrative pattern, it resembles a tale of visiting another world. The narrator I stayed in the remote village called Naui. However, what we should notice here is that the journey at the end, depicted in chapter 30, is not a narrator's journey. It's a departure of Kyuichi and Nami's husband. Let me quote a passage from the final chapter. With a single term that will, Kyuichi is no longer a man our world. He goes off a distant place. Kyuichi, who is about to go to such a place, stands silently in the train looking at us. The bond between Kyuichi, who drove us out from the mountains, and us, who are drawn out, breaks here. It's already beginning to break. This is a scene where the train carrying Kyuichi, who is heading to the Russo-Japanese War, and Nami's husband begin to move. The train door separates those who leave from those who remain. Here, I want to draw attention to one word that is repeated: bond. Or inga, bond or inga, a karmatic connection. I will skip the detailed analysis, but in Kusamakura, word inga functioned as a key term for describing the ties between important characters. In this scene, we notice something striking. The narrator, who was consistently referred to himself as I, suddenly speaks as we. While describing his bond with Kyuichi, this shift in pronoun emerges almost unintentionally. How should we read this we? The final journey in Kusamakura is not the narrator's journey. In other words, the narrator's journey is not brought to a close. Rather, what is being narrated here is a moment when the narrator ceases to be solitary I and begin to speak as a part of the collective as we among those connected to Nami. He is, in effect, beginning to form new bonds with these people. By paying attention to the behavior of the travel tag, we are led to reconsider the meaning of the journey at the end of the novel. If we read the novel from the perspective of the travel tag, a new interpretation begins to emerge. The narrator's own journey does not simply come to an end, and the final journey is not his. Rather, what is taking place here is a shift in position. The narrator is no longer speaking as an isolated I. Instead, he began to speak a part of the group as one among those connected to Nami. In this moment, he enters a new set of relationship. In other words, the novel ends not by closing the narrator's journey, but by opening new network connections, a new bond that links him to others. Okay, let me conclude. In the latter half of this talk, I have shown how structuring source novel with TEI tag can open up new directions for research. In the first part, I used a distant reading approach to compare multiple works. At the same time, a TEI-based analysis can also support close reading. In the second part, I used Kusamakura as an example, showing how the behavior of the travel tag reveals a singular point in the narrative. From there, I demonstrated how quantitative patterns can lead us back to renewed close reading. In Japan, digital humanities approaches have not yet spread widely in the field of Japanese literary studies, especially in the study of modern Japanese literature. However, if we look at closely, we can see change beginning to happen. Interest in digital humanities is growing among younger scholars and graduate students. Some of my own students who are originally trained in more traditional approaches have started to experiment with the digital humanities method. At the same time, the Japanese government is clearly directing more research funding towards information technology. This shift is also evident in the rapid expansion of digital data made available by the National Diet Library. These developments are already transforming the research environment. However, I do not believe that digital humanities will replace traditional literary studies. What will become important, in my view, is how we integrate these approaches. We should make full use of strengths and possibilities of quantitative analysis. But it would be misguided to expect computers to take over all aspects of literary research. AI, in this sense, should be understood as a research partner. Okay, so finally, let me share the download site, the TI, a data set of source novel that our team has developed. It is currently at the version 1, and we are still working to improve this accuracy. However, it's already sufficient for exploratory analysis. If you are interested, I encourage you to try use it again. Okay, so thank you very much. I look forward to your comments and questions. Thank you for listening.